This is going to be our second part to section 2.3. And if you recall from part 1, we had actually began our discussion on the carbon compounds by talking about the carbohydrates. And I'd also given you a little bit of information about what a macromolecule was, how that macromolecule is formed using the process of polymerization, and basically just kind of getting us started with the whole idea of organic chemistry. So in part 2, our main focus today is going to be on the lipids, which you can see are right up here in the upper left-hand corner. And the lipids are going to be the fats. And again, this is a type of macromolecule. And we're going to be talking about the nucleic acids, which are right here. And the nucleic acids would be like RNA and DNA. And then down here towards the bottom, what we have is we have the proteins. And as most of us know, proteins typically involve the meats. And so we're talking about things like beef, could be talking about things like pork. If you notice, we have some crayfish over here on the right, and of course chicken. And you would find some protein in milk as well, and then of course some cheeses and the eggs. So today we're going to begin our discussion by talking about the lipids, or more commonly known as the fats. Now, lipids are made mostly from carbon and hydrogen atoms. Now, if you recall when we talked about the carbohydrates, those were made from carbon, they were made from hydrogen, and they were also made primarily of oxygen. Now, that's what makes this particular type of macromolecule a little bit different from the carbs we had talked about previously. Now, something else that makes them a little bit more different is that fats tend to not be soluble in water. Now, what does that mean? It means that all the fats you see on the right-hand side, if you expose them to water, they're not going to be able to mix together. They're not going to be able to basically dissolve into that water. I'm guessing that a lot of us at one point have seen when you mix a fat with water, you end up with that layer right at the top. And what that does is it indicates there's no mixing occurring between those two substances. So that's what we mean by not soluble in water. Now, there's several different types of lipids. Oftentimes, if you think about a nice piece of steak, sometimes there's going to be the edges of that steak, which are kind of gristly. In other words, they're kind of thick and they're kind of slimy. That's going to be the fat that came from that piece of beef. And that's a solid type of fat. Now, we also have fats that, of course, that are represented by liquids. We do have fats that are represented by waxes. So the wax that you might use to make a candle actually is a type of lipid. And then there's actually those types of fats that are incorporated into the hormones that we have in our bodies. Steroids would be a good example of that. And so that is another category of a lipid. Now, lipids can be used to store energy, and so of course if you think about the carbs we had talked about previously, that's going to be the first type of material that our body is going to use to actually gain energy from. So the carbs that we take in when we eat different types of foods, we're going to break those down and take the energy from those carbs first. But of course, if any of those carbs are transformed into fat, that's a way for us to store long-term energy. So in cases where we may not have access to those carbs, our body can actually start to remove the energy from those stored fats. Now, create biological membranes, so the cell membrane itself is actually a form of a material that actually contains fat. Waterproof coverings, for example, if you think about wax paper, for example, and you put a few drops of water on that wax paper, it's going to kind of bead or run off. That's a type of fat that's going to be used to make that material. Then, as I had said, hormones can actually act as chemical messengers because hormones tell the different parts of our body what to do, but there's a component of fat to them as well. Now, lipids are made when you actually combine what we call a glycerol, and if you look over here on the right to the structure of a fat, the glycerol is right here, and then we have something called fatty acids, and so the fatty acid is going to be right here, sometimes called fatty acid chains. And typically there's going to be 3 fatty acid chains. If you notice, we have 1, 2, and we have 3. And so this is the basic composition of a fat molecule. Now, I'm not going to require you guys to memorize this entire structure, but I do expect you to know there's 2 parts to a fat, and one of those, of course, is the fatty acid, and the other one is glycerol. Now, something I had mentioned back in our previous screencast on carbs, I had said that most macromolecules are formed through polymerization. In other words, we take the monomers, those very small units, and we create polymers, which are going to be those macromolecules. Now, fats or lipids are going to be the exception to the rule. If you notice, we really don't have a series of repeated units in this structure, so it's not really considered a polymer. but it is a really super large molecule, so we do lump it into the category of macromolecules. So it is the exception to the rule. Now, when you do talk about fats, as I had said a little bit earlier, we do have those fats that are good for us, and we have those fats that are not so good for us. And so what we do is we actually place them into three categories. We have the saturated fats, we have the unsaturated, and we have the polyunsaturated. Now, saturated fats are those that have carbon-to-carbon single bonds only. So this is important because when you look at the structure of a fat, in other words, that glycerol with those fatty acid chains, if you do not see any double bonds between the carbons, then that is considered a saturated fat. They do tend to be a solid at room temperature because of that structure, and unfortunately they do tend to raise that bad cholesterol that sometimes doctors mention. Now, over here on the right, you can see the structure of a saturated fatty acid. Now, I want to bring something to your attention. You can actually see a double bond occurring between this oxygen and this carbon, so this right here. Now, my fear is that you're going to assume that this is a double bond and maybe place this into one of the other two categories because they do have double bonds. But you got to remember, it's a double bond between the carbon and carbon. In other words, if you're talking about a saturated fatty acid, there are zero double bonds between those carbons anywhere in this structure. So I need you to ignore this double bond right here because it's between a carbon and an oxygen, not between two carbons. Now, when you talk about unsaturated lipids or fats, they do have at least one carbon-to-carbon double bond. So down here in the middle, you can see we still have that same oxygen to carbon double bond, but if you go over here to the right here, you can see a double bond occurring between those two carbons. You don't see something like this up here in this structure. So again, this would be a good indicator of an unsaturated fatty acid, and these are the ones that tend to be a little bit better for you. They do tend to be liquids at room temperature, and they do tend to lower that bad cholesterol. Now, polyunsaturated, if you look at the prefix poly means many, has more than one carbon-to-carbon double bond. And so I don't have a picture of the structure of this particular type of fat, but again, imagine that we have a structure that has many of these carbon-to-carbon double bonds occurring. They do tend to be liquids, and again, they're really good for you, so they do tend to lower that LDL, or bad cholesterol. And you find these particular types of fats typically in some oils. Definitely you will find them in fish and some other. Flaxseed would be another good example of finding polyunsaturated fats, and a few other food items that are out there. So saturated are the ones you want to stay away from. Unsaturated and polyunsaturated are going to be the ones that are a little bit better for you. Now, the third type of macromolecule is the macromolecule called the nucleic acid. And nucleic acids are super important to us because they carry the information that we find within our cells. In other words, that DNA and that RNA, which is an information-carrying molecule, is called a nucleic acid. Now, these are polymers. So again, we had said the fats are not considered polymers. They're just macromolecules because they're really large, but nucleic acids are polymers. And they do contain hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, of course, but if you look here, they contain a couple of other elements. They contain nitrogen, and they also contain phosphorus. So this kind of sets it apart from the previous two that we've just talked about. Now, again, since they are considered polymers, they do have individual units called monomers. And what we call those monomers are nucleotides. And that nucleotide has three basic parts. It has a phosphate, it has a sugar, and it has a nitrogen base. And when we talk about DNA and RNA later on in the year, we're going to educate you guys quite a bit on the structure of a nucleotide. Now, all of this together is considered one unit. And so a nucleotide, in fact, many nucleotides connected together, is going to give us that polymer or that nucleic acid. Now, as I had said, there's two types of nucleic acids. We have RNA and we have DNA, and they both carry the information that basically makes us who we are. It's our genetic information. Now, if you notice over here on the right, we have a couple of animations. This one over here on the far right is a double-stranded molecule, and that's going to be our DNA. And the one right next to it is going to be single-stranded, and that's going to be our RNA. And that's how you can recognize the difference between these two in a structural sense. And they both carry information, but there is also one other difference. The RNA does contain the sugar ribose, and DNA contains the sugar deoxyribose. Now, the very last macromolecule that we're going to talk about are going to be proteins. And if you notice, it says it contains nitrogen, as well as the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen. Now, again, these are polymers. They do fall into that category, and they are actually put together through a process called polymerization, which we had talked about in the previous video. And the monomer for this particular polymer is going to be the amino acid. Now, the amino acid here actually contains 4 parts. It contains a hydrogen, an amino group, a carboxyl group, and then you have a group right down here. If you notice, it says variant, basically meaning that all of the amino acids that are used to put together a specific type of protein will have these 3 parts. They'll all be exactly the same in reference to these 3 parts, but this is the part that's going to vary between the different types of amino acids that are used to make that protein. Now, proteins themselves have many functions. They can be used to control the rate of reactions, so enzymes, which we'll talk about in section 2.4. They can regulate cell processes. They can actually form certain cell structures. They can transport things into or out of cells, and we'll talk about that when we talk about cell transport. And they are also really good at helping us to fight disease. So this particular screen is going to sort of illustrate how a protein is put together. So remember, a protein is a polymer. So what we have is we have lots of amino acids being used, basically bonded together to form that long chain or that polymer. Now there's about 20 different amino acids in nature. And some of these amino acids we can actually make ourselves, but there's others we actually have to find in our diet. And so if you notice up here towards the top, we have something called peptide bonds. Now that's really important because that is the specific type of bond that's going to be used to basically connect those different types of amino acids. So we have 2 amino acids being represented here. We have alanine and we have serine. Now, as I had said in the previous screen, these 3 parts right up here, if you notice, are exactly the same between the 2 different types of amino acids. But what's different is that R group. It's that variant group. And so that's what makes alanine different from serine. So the peptide bond is going to be used to connect these 2 together and produce the protein. Now you can have a protein with as few as 10 amino acids all bonded together, or it could have hundreds, if not thousands, of amino acids bonded together. Class.